So thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here. I do want to start out by noting that although most of the folks on the line are probably affiliated with SFI through the utilization of the SFI program standards, SFI has been an evolving organization for some time, and we recently are undertaking a strategic planning effort, and we consider ourselves to be an organization that is attempting to advance sustainability through forest-focused collaboration. We have a vision that society values and benefits from sustainably managed forests, and we do this through a number of means. And so, of course, including but not limited to the implementation of the SFI program standards. For those of you who may know a little bit less about SFI, and there are a lot of partner organizations on the phone, we do have a board that reflects the diversity of sustainable practices and the thoughts about sustainability, the three-legged stool of economy, environment, and social interests. And so our board is reflective of that diversity. And as we've evolved as an organization, we've now expressed four primary areas of the work that we do. Obviously, the SFI program standards, which I mentioned, the certification standards. Also, education-related programs, which is primarily influenced or managed now by our Project Learning Tree program, which came over to SFI within the last 2 years. And lastly, community engagement, as made most evidenced by the engagement of our SFI implementation committees and our indigenous engagement programs and those sorts of things. So we operate across these four areas. We're going to focus today on conservation, which is largely around trying to ensure that the footprint of SFI, which is considerable in North America, as you'll hear in a moment, that footprint really inures to the benefit of conservation-related outcomes at an appropriate scale, so that we really are having a positive and beneficial impact on the landscapes that we have some influence over. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Darren Sleep, who is our Senior Director of Conservation Science and Strategy, and Darren will introduce our speaker today as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. As Paul said, SFI has a substantial footprint in North America, and that lends itself to having the scale to make a difference with over 300 million acres, or if you're Canadian, a little over 124 million hectares certified to SFI in North America. And that doesn't include the number of hectares in several parts of North America that are influenced heavily by the SFI fiber sourcing standard. With that kind of a footprint, it behooves us to really think about how we can improve the conservation outcomes of forestry as we go forward. Within our standard, there's a requirement of SFI program participants to participate as actively as possible in research. And you can see from this slide that in 2017, that's the last reporting year we have right on here right now, that has resulted, and we practiced with our program participants, that's resulted in almost $59 million worth of forest research in 2017. And when we start thinking about the total investment, it's over $1.6 billion since 1995. So that's a substantial kick to increase the amount of certification research that gets done and conservation research. And as the slide says, more than 75% of this research funding is linked directly to conservation-related objectives. But not only does that benefit research, but it also benefits the SFI network or the SFI sort of family, the number of organizations that contribute to this work. And you can see here that over 550 unique partner organizations from various sectors within the conservation world are contributing to this work. So this is a fantastic thing. Within the SFI effort, though, we started focusing about 4 years ago on what we call the Conservation Impact Program. And Conservation Impact, this was some work that was done prior to my tenure with SFI, but this was all about connecting brand owners all the way down the chain to the conservation benefits on the land. Now, back, as I said, 4 or 5 years ago, we got together with a group of folks that sat on what we call our Conservation Impact Sounding Board, and we identified what the key topics were for this program. And they were, as the slide says, water, climate change, and biodiversity. Now, today we're going to be talking specifically about climate change and carbon. So you may ask yourself, why are we even talking about carbon? Well, obviously, climate change and carbon are a huge global issue that needs to be have a lot of focus put on it. The work of SFI focuses primarily on climate change resiliency and carbon sequestration. We're looking at ways to use markets to provide mitigation benefits and focus on a regional scale. So obviously SFI is focused primarily in North America. We are looking at not just the contributory value of SFI certified forests in terms of how much carbon is sequestered on SFI's footprint, but also on the sequestration rate, and to focus a little bit on better understanding the best practices that we can use to improve that footprint. Now, within the portfolio of SFI's work, we've been working with the Saskatchewan Research Council and the Canadian Forest Service. Shout out to Stephen Cull, I know who's on the call today. We've been working with these folks for a few years now on this forest carbon assessment of SFI's footprint in North America, rather in Canada. This work is ongoing, and we're approaching, I think, the end of that particular project, and we'll see where it goes going forward. But this is using carbon budget models to account for the amount of sequestration over time of the SFI forestry footprint in Canada. Beyond that work, particularly in the U.S., we've been working with a number of partners, including the University of Maine, Manomet, Keeping Maine's Forests, and American Forests, to look at various ways we can think about climate resiliency and looking at practice-based approaches to increasing forest carbon and so on, doing all kinds of work. Now, again, all this work is part of our Conservation Impact Program, which is directed, at least in part, by our Conservation Impact Sounding Board. This is a loose affiliation of organizations that get together with SFI once or twice a year and talk about the work we're doing. They help guide this work and contribute to directions we might take with this work. You can see here from these logos, this is just some of the participants that have been on the Conservation Impact Sounding Board. Many of these have actually been organizations that have received grants from SFI. And I should point out that this Conservation Impact Sounding Board is a loose affiliation. If anyone is interested in participating in these meetings, all they have to do is contact any one of us on the conservation team, and we can certainly get you involved. I should point out that at the end of this presentation, we will put up our contact information so you can reach us. Now, with that, I would like to introduce Lauren Cooper. Lauren has been working with the Forest Carbon and Climate Program at the University of Michigan. She actually attended our last Conservation Impact Sounding Board meeting and gave a great presentation. We were so impressed with that presentation that we've asked her to come today and present the work that they've been doing with SFI. And with that, I will turn it over to Lauren.
Thank you so much. Am I coming in clearly?
Sounds good to me.
Okay,
yes, thank
very
you.
good. Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much for the background and the introduction. I am really delighted to be here today and to share a little bit of the work that we do in our program, and specifically in partnership with SFI in the last year. Just a brief introduction, again, I'm Lauren Cooper. I direct the Forest Carbon and Climate Program in the Forestry Department at Michigan State University, and I'll give a little introduction on our activities as well. For today, let me remember how to turn this. Today, just to give you a quick overview, I'm just going to give a few points on our program, and then give a little overview on this overarching topic of carbon and climate and our forest. And then I'll go into the research project itself and our preliminary findings, and I'll close with a quick discussion of some continued engagement and education opportunities through our programming. Okay, so we've been functioning almost completely. We use a lot of online programming in the FCCP. We've been functioning since 2012, but we have faculty expertise that predates that by quite a bit. We have a lot of global participation in our programming. We currently have a completely online graduate certificate in forest carbon science policy and management. We are right now launching a USDA-funded short course. I'll have more information on that shortly. But generally, we have highly adaptable programming. We recognize that this is a very interdisciplinary topic area. We find that there's a lot of a range of professions that are finding themselves needing to know a little bit about this carbon, climate, forest piece. But they may have a wide range of backgrounds and different types of training. So, for example, we get everything from a PhD in soil science to somebody who's strictly in international policy. So we have a lot of pretty interdisciplinary and diverse educational approach. This activity falls, we have these activity areas, so we have formal education, as I mentioned, a graduate certificate, non-formal education, research and projects, and stakeholder engagement. The work we've done here with SFI really falls into a few, but what targeted this for us was our non-formal education. I wanted to start including more content specifically about the role of certified forests and certified sustainable forestry in our educational programming, and just found that there wasn't a lot readily available explaining this connection. And so that's why we have undertaken this project, and the outputs for this will inform our non-formal education. And so just to dive into this a little bit, and most of us are probably familiar with this, but I do like to start with just a quick topic background. Why are we focusing on climate change mitigation and adaptation with forests? This is an example of one of the graphics that we've produced that we think is the right balance between simple and yet kind of developing this intuitive understanding of carbon cycling. CO2, as we all know, is a extremely important greenhouse gas. It's one of the most important produced by humans and is one of the leading causes of a warming climate. But carbon cycles naturally through our systems as well. So it has natural cycles through the natural system, through the atmosphere, through our water cycles, and through plants, and through us. We're all made of carbon. And so this is just an example of how trees, through photosynthesis and respiration, have an exchange of gases and absorb CO2 directly from the atmosphere, bringing it into their physical bodies, and it ends up contributing to plant waste and decomposition to move that carbon into soil pools as well. And then scaling up a little bit, if you have a forested area, then on the left you have your land flux of CO2 in this case, we could say, that you have your pools of carbon fluxes between different pools, including in the atmosphere. But you also have the ocean, which has its own major fluxes of CO2 and other gases. And then in the middle, you have what we call anthropogenic pools and fluxes. So these are caused by humans. So land use change, use of fossil fuels, and related emissions, including in cement production. And so this leads us to why we're talking about forests, is that forests have been identified in some recent work as a natural climate solution. And there's a range of activities that are highlighted in this particular paper, but forests rise to the top as some of the most immediate, most cost-effective solutions. And these include activities like conservation, restoration, improved land or forest management. And the approach here is highlighted because it increases carbon storage or avoids greenhouse gas emissions, and it falls under both adaptation and mitigation. So adaptation is the idea of adapting to a changing climate. And so, for example, in forests, that would be ensuring your forest health going forward, perhaps in light of drought conditions. And then mitigation is more specifically absorbing the CO2 and storing carbon for the long term. And then, so this is my last background graphic, but for those of us that are in the forest sector, I think it's really important for us to all be able to start communicating and thinking about the forest sector carbon cycle. So in the center, in the lighter green, we have this natural carbon cycle that is kind of the first image that I showed. So we have living vegetation and different carbon pools, so down, forest floor. You probably could include soil here as well. But what's also calculated in carbon cycling with forest products is harvested wood is considered a long-term carbon pool as well. It depends on the product of the like paper only is estimated about 3 years, whereas construction could be estimated between 70 to 100 years. But so here we see harvested wood, wood for energy, wood products, and something called the substitution effect, which I'll touch on in a little bit as well. But I think this is a really important way that us in the forestry sector can start thinking about and being able to communicate the carbon and climate benefits of forests. So it's not just a natural forest, but also working forests and that the carbon cycle associated with that. So to get into the project a little bit, as I mentioned, we were interested in developing more direct linkages between carbon and climate change mitigation and adaptation and forestry. That this is a big area. Working forests are extremely important economically. They're also an important climate change solution as far as providing sustainable materials, sustainable products. But we all know that forest lands have really important benefits on the landscape as well. So we wanted to take a look at the existing standard itself, the objectives of SFI, and take a look and also undertook some interviews with various stakeholders to better understand and to create a kind of theoretical framework of how are these bigger topics interconnected, with the idea that we can move forward with more quantitative research objectives with this kind of theoretical framework laid out about these linkages. So to do this, a lot of our emphasis was looking directly, explicitly at the SFI principles. And so that's what we see here. This is a full list of principles. They're quite interdisciplinary, everything from the forest itself to biological diversity, legal considerations, communication, education. So we really kind of dug into the standards themselves to see what is in here that's actually already providing or already tightly in line with carbon, with climate mitigation and adaptation. For those of you that are familiar with SFI, you're aware of these, but we still want to highlight that we looked at the various standards within SFI, and of course, FSC is also a certification standard that we looked at briefly, but we spent most of our time looking at the SFI standards. Generally, though, the benefits and the linkages for climate are very similar between these fundamental core principles of certification. And what I want to introduce too is this concept of climate smart forestry. So if you're unfamiliar with this idea, it's a concept that's come up quite a bit in the academic space. It's also becoming pretty prevalent in Europe. But it's just this, it's a pretty simple idea that it's a targeted approach or strategy to increase climate benefits from forests and the forest sector. And so we kind of pose this question, does forest certification fundamentally equal climate smart forestry? Are these kind of the same? Could these be kind of the same thing? Yeah, I think that many of us kind of get tired of new ideas or completely supposedly new ways of thinking about things, when in fact there's a lot of alignment between what we think of as best practices. So that was another kind of driving force here, is how do we think about what we already recognize as good practices and put them through this climate smart forestry lens? So there's 3 pillars here. It's reducing or removing greenhouse gas emissions, adapting forest management to build resilient forests, and active forest management aiming to sustainably increase productivity and provide all of the benefits that forests can provide. Obviously, there's trade-offs, but we just want to introduce this idea as this was kind of an overarching concept that framed our analysis. So going back now to the full list, of the principles, we found that really all of them, except for maybe you could probably make a case for aesthetics and recreation, but we'll leave that one out for now. But that really all of these had clear and distinct climate connections in all of these principles. So we're going to break these down a little bit and show you how we ended up thinking about these and are communicating them. So we ended up approaching this through 3 major categories. Category 1 are core carbon and climate concepts. So they're fundamental concepts including climate change mitigation, carbon, and adaptation. Category 2 is more on the management and the carbon storage specifically. So these are core considerations for managing, measuring, protecting, and planning for carbon storage. So this is really the mitigation piece, more fully fleshed out. And then category 3 is best practices with climate benefits. So this is this broader array of best practices that provide link to or allow for climate benefits. And we're going to break these more down and show you some specific examples, both in examples of how to think about these and then also really specific examples from the standards themselves. So starting with this category 1. So for those that are not as comfortably be thinking about mitigation, I think that what I have found in my work is that there is there's still a lot of not a lot of certainty about the role of forests, particularly people that aren't in the forest sector. It can be a little confusing. We have international forest loss issues, so we have serious issues with deforestation and forest loss, and so it becomes a little unclear on if wood utilization is good for. Is that okay for climate? Is it not okay for climate? And so part of our work has been to clarify that really climate change and the framework that's emerging around climate change really does present opportunities for sustainable forests, and particularly for certified sustainable forests. So sustainability does not mean stopping forest management. It does mean an emphasis on maintaining forest cover and not losing forests, ensuring the quality of your forest and ensuring forest health, maintaining, restoring, and increasing carbon sequestration, and safeguarding remaining global forests. So one of the things that I highlight is keep forests as forests, but also try to keep working forests as working forests and natural forests as natural forests. So this is just kind of this overarching idea and where certification fits in. So harvested wood is part of a climate solution, but it only is if it's sustainable. And sustainability can be hard to define, and it really is hard to track once trees are harvested. It depends on where you are in the world on how difficult they are to track, but that can be the case. So certification comes in to ensure sustainability in management and procurement and in those climate benefits. And so here are some primary activities that are associated with climate benefits. And so if you're familiar at all with forest carbon projects, these are the types of activities that can earn credits. And so we this is what we pull out in the next section too to look more closely but at these types of management approaches. But they include improved forest management, harvested wood products themselves, afforestation and reforestation, which is reestablishing forest cover. The difference for afforestation is it depends slightly on the definition or who created the definition, but it generally that it hasn't been forested in a longer period of time. So sometimes it could be a couple of decades, whereas reforestation implies it was recently deforested or harvested. And then avoided conversion, so preventing the conversion of forest land to non-forest. And then here are, speaking of carbon, so here are the carbon pools that we see related to carbon and our climate and forests. So these include both living and non-living pools, but also wood products as well, and soil, of course. And then we have this idea of adaptation. And so these are this mitigation, carbon, adaptation. These are kind of principles that we saw sort of sprinkled throughout the standards. And the fundamental idea here for adaptation is that resilient, healthy forests is climate adaptation. So in the SFI examples here, protecting and supporting productivity and health and biological diversity can also have long-term benefits for improving forest health, and particularly if there's changing conditions. And then so to move into category 2 here, we have, and this is where we're going to get more into the meat of what we looked at. This is the management and the carbon storage pieces. And so there's a lot of work in this space, particularly for in policy making, a lot of conversations about how detailed do we want to get as far as creating incentives or creating forest carbon projects. And so it's really interesting to look at and consider how certification may be or is likely already having a very positive impact as far as carbon storage, but it hasn't necessarily been framed as a carbon storage approach in the past, even though the activities that are promoted within the standard are the same activities that are being discussed in the policy space and being discussed and being undertaken in forest carbon projects. So again, these are the same that we mentioned just in the last section, particular to carbon and to mitigation. There are these five major activity areas that are pointed to when you're looking at carbon. So it's improved forest management, harvested wood products, reforestation, afforestation, and avoided conversion. And so I've just pulled a couple of these examples to look at for this presentation today. The first is improved forest management. And so improved forest management can be thought of in a number of ways. One would be increasing productivity, so increasing forest growth for timber products generally. But it's important to keep in mind that has also increased productivity and growth for carbon and carbon storage. So certified healthy and managed forests can also store more carbon on the landscape at any given time. So you can change your harvest regimes to store more carbon on the landscape or to increase the productivity. So there's some different types of goals that can be included in improved forest management. But they can be more productive and allow greater inputs into other long-term carbon storage pools, including in harvested wood products. So this is a kind of important way to think about that as well. So if you're increasing productivity on the landscape, you're also, depending on where those products are ending up, you could be increasing long-term carbon storage there as well. But that connecting IFM is also going to be incorporating science and best practices and includes practices that have reduced negative impacts. And then we also have trained professionals that are making and implementing these decisions, but ultimately that, especially through the network of certification, and I'll highlight this shortly, they're better able to incorporate climate mitigation and adaptation planning because they're already making these types of considerations in their management plans. This is a graphic that we highlight as well to show, this would be highlighting carbon storage. So if you had just your project baseline or what's also called a business as usual approach, BAU, this could be like a standard intensive harvest regime for a working forest land. So you have a pretty somewhat constrained level of carbon on the landscape over time and a pretty intense harvest. And so one approach to have an improved forest management, again, there could be various approaches, but maybe the goal was to have just store more carbon on the landscape, but then after a while maintain a similar carbon cycle. So in this case, and maybe there's other goals on the landscape as well that this aligns with, maybe certain type of habitat protection. So this would be an appropriate approach that you would have maybe a delayed harvest, skip a few cycles so that you had an increased stocking on the landscape, and then you could continue to harvest as you previously were, but you'd have a heightened amount of carbon on the landscape. So this is just one example of an approach to increase carbon storage. But then when we look at specifically at SFI, what we see is that in the standard, there's some really explicit linkages to some of the core improved forest management approaches. So objective 1 says to broaden implementation of sustainable forestry and sustainable harvest levels. And so this is bringing in, and this is as defined by the standard, but this is bringing in additional landowners, additional decision makers into these principles, into these best practices, which are likely going to have those kind of carbon benefits either on the landscape or in the harvested wood product pools. And this is really important to point out because in many states, I mean, we have best management practices across the country, but in many states, they're not required, including here in Michigan. They're completely optional. So you can see the value of certification in bringing more landowners in alignment with these types of values where they may not actually have regulatory guidelines for that type of encouragement. Another key idea is avoiding degradation, and this is another principle of improved forest management. So forest degradation, as we all know, would result in diminished productivity, but also in the loss of carbon storage. And sometimes it can be a longer-term loss. So if a landscape is really disrupted, the soil will continue to lose carbon for sometimes decades following a disruption, and it can also then slow recovery times because once it's continuing to lose carbon, it's really losing its soil, its richness, and its fertility. So then it can really slow that recovery time down. So this is an issue, and this is something that's specifically addressed by SFI in the standard. And so here's one that that program participants shall implement forest management practices to protect and maintain forest and soil productivity. So this is a very explicit approach that is avoiding degradation. It's a big area of research internationally of how to have working and productive landscapes, but that they don't become degraded over time. And so here you can see how certification, and there's some very specific examples here, erosion control measures, being aware of post-harvest conditions. So here you can see how the standard is bringing in these types of beneficial considerations into the land management itself. And then here's another big topic area that I've kind of been touching on a bit here, but the role of harvested wood products. And again, this is a big area for carbon storage and for and becoming more important in climate considerations. So a lot of policy makers are starting to think, how do we use less cement? A lot of these materials are very emissions intensive, so cement and steel. How do we go back to using some of these more traditional materials that have a lot of benefits as far as building times, shipping, moving materials around, but then also greenhouse gas emissions. So they're showing to have a lot of benefits across the board and in energy efficiency. So how do greenhouse gases and how does carbon fit into this conversation? And it actually fits pretty tightly, particularly if you're using wood products and you can account for carbon storage. We actually have going up on Michigan State's campus the first tall wood building or mass timber building going up on campus right now here, which is pretty exciting that it's being viewed as a climate smart material. But the key is that it's only going to be considered climate smart if the materials are sustainable. If you're ultimately leading to deforestation, you're not going to be able to make a climate benefit or make a climate claim for that wood product. So this is where certification comes in, and if you're ensuring, for example, here that you have efficient use of your fiber resources, you're minimizing waste, you're not contributing to forest loss, and this is another example coming up, that you can really make a strong case for harvested wood products. And so here we have some examples of using appropriate forest harvesting technology. There's a lot of research on the impacts of destructive practices in forests that are resulting in necessary losses and mortality in the remaining trees. So emphasizing the most efficient processes for harvesting wood, and then also broaden the sustainability or the awareness of sustainability in wood procurement systems and increasing market uptake will have really direct carbon and climate benefits as well. But again, it's not as easy to make a case for the climate benefits if you don't have some sort of third-party certification to ensure that there's transparency and sustainability in the wood procurement process. And then just to touch on this briefly, because I think we all can make some assumptions on know fundamentally reforestation and afforestation are going to have carbon and climate benefits. But it is good to point out, and that this is an explicit part of the standard as well. Reforestation studies have shown quite a range, depending, of course, on your ecological zone and your forest cover type. But reforestation, purposeful reforestation, can increase sequestration by 0.7 to 5.2 metric tons of carbon per hectare for up to 120 years when compared to just a natural regeneration. So there's a very distinct carbon and climate benefit to purposeful restoration. And again, this does depend on your forest ecosystem type, what types of approaches are appropriate in different locations. But fundamentally, reforestation does provide obviously a quicker recovery time and a quicker growth and possibly reduced loss of carbon from the soil over time instead of leaving area exposed. And then here we see in the SFI Standard just very explicit language that program participants shall promptly reforest after final harvest. So just again, in a lot of states where there are not BMPs are not required or they're quasi-regulatory, having this additional layer of guidance and oversight can really help to ensure that these practices are truly being implemented on the landscape. And then this is a big one internationally, but it also is important domestically as in North America as well, but preventing conversion of forest land to non-forest. And I think that this is kind of a win-win for anyone involved in the forest sector that we can all get behind, that seeing the value of working forests and being able to communicate them is going to be good for forests and good for people that are part of the forest economy, so rural jobs. And the more that we're able to value those forests, the more we're able to keep those forests standing, and particularly in high growth areas where we have increasing sprawl or other types of infrastructure that are changing the way that we're considering our land use, and it's really not viable for landowners to keep their forests in comparison to other high opportunity costs for land. So having this emphasis is a really big part of the international forestry conversation, and I think that we could do I think there's a lot of work to be done domestically for us that work in the forestry sector to highlight just the role and the value of working forests in carbon and climate, and so that we can really communicate why they're important to maintain them. And then here in SFI, we have really clear example that they avoiding conversion explicitly. So in the forest management planning, here we see below forest lands that they shall not be converted to non-forest land use. And then separately for, this is part of the fiber sourcing standard, to avoid controversial sources, including illegally logged wood from offshore fiber sourcing, is really important because I've done quite a bit of work internationally, and that's where you get more issues of illegality, and a lot of times that could be contributing to deforestation and conversion to other types of land uses. So having this extra layer of protection for those types of land uses can be really important as well. And then quickly, I'm just going to go through this last section here, which is the additional best practices with climate benefits. And here we looked at the idea, the concept of certification more broadly, and considered the network, the communication around certification, and the role of SFI. So I've had the opportunity to participate in some SFI meetings, speak with some of the people that are both within SFI and our program participants, and particularly in the state of Michigan, the implementation committee, to understand a little bit more what's the role of certification in communication and in bolstering understanding of these topics. Here's the full list of things that we looked at under this. So everything from kind of communication, stakeholder engagement, transparency, monitoring and reporting, improving efficiency, incorporating science and spreading knowledge, special sites and cultural values, watershed management, biodiversity and native species and its role in resiliency, and corporate social responsibility. We just pulled out a few of them for our presentation today. But one that's really important to highlight is the role of clear messaging. So certification has sort of laid the platform, we're arguing has laid a platform to be able to start talking about forest products and their carbon and their climate benefits in a way that can be comprehensible to the public. For people that aren't familiar with forest management, where these materials come from, people are well aware of these logos now. It's recognizable, they're visible, they're well established, and I think that this has kind of created a platform that now we can go forward for those of us in the forestry sector and be able to communicate with those, particularly also individuals in the corporate world, that this can be part of your corporate social responsibility. This can be part of your climate mitigation activities for your company. This can be a way that individual consumers can increase their responsibility and their climate action if that's what's motivating them in their purchasing decisions and how they use their purchasing power. So this is a really powerful platform that certification has created and has worked decades to build this kind of brand recognition and a fundamental understanding that it means something sustainable. And so I think that it's kind of primed to be ready to make this linkage to climate mitigation as well. And then just as an example, a couple of examples here from the SFI Standard, broadening the practice of sustainable forestry through public outreach and education and involvement. Again, this has really has already been underway. This has already been done. There's been a lot of communication around this, and it's set up a nice platform and a nice foundation on which to move forward with communicating the climate benefits of forestry and sustainable forest products as well. And then to talk a little bit about incorporating science and knowledge, this was one of the probably one of the most interesting components of this project was getting to know the team in Michigan, the implementation committee here a bit, and seeing how are they communicating these topics and how do they get this information out here, who do they engage with. And what we generally found is that there are really excellent materials for learning and communication. People were really passionate about their work, about bringing these best practices to decision makers on the ground. So whether they're property owners or they're loggers, like actual people that are working and making decisions, implementing them on the ground. There was really nice up-to-date learning materials, a lot of energy behind this, and we really saw that the value, that there was a huge value in the implementation committees themselves. So it wasn't just that there's this national level standard that's coming down, but that these implementation committees are tailoring and interpreting and going further on specific topics that were necessary for their landscapes and for their land, for their actors on the landscapes as well. And we found that this really improves the ability to incorporate new knowledge and findings, and this is going to be increasingly important with the changing climate. What we know of as best practices and the science is changing faster now than it has for decades in the past. And so we're having a network to get this information out and be able to train and adjust best practices is going to be increasingly important. And we really see a great role for the implementation committees in helping to do this. And just here's some examples. Some other states have their own implementation committees, and you could see looking at their materials, tailored information, and just kind of primed and ready to be able to support decision makers as people are starting to get hungry for more information about climate and recognizing that there are threats to our forests and to forest health that will unfortunately be exacerbated by a changing climate, depending on your location. And then this is just an example of the Michigan Implementation Committee logger training schedule. It's really robust, lots of options, lots of different geographies, and just a lot of people engaging that otherwise maybe wouldn't be coming together and having these types of conversations. And they're coming together yearly or even multiple times a year to talk about this. So again, we think this is a good platform for increasing uptake there. Sorry about that. Okay. So to wrap it up, we have just some kind of key findings and closing thoughts here. What we really found is that from a broad definition, certification is climate smart forest management. It is setting the stage for climate smart forest management. One of the tensions, I think, when we start talking about climate and carbon is that there can be concerns about prioritizing carbon or climate too much in comparison to some of these other goals and objectives for different landscapes. So we have a lot of different needs from our forests. So we have watershed, water quality issues, recreation, different habitats, private land use. There's all sorts of different needs. And I think one of the key takeaways is that particularly for working forest lands, carbon and climate is a natural fit with all of these other best practices. If certification is already taking into account all of these robust conservation, sustainability goals and targets for different species and such, that bringing in the topics of climate and carbon are really tightly aligned. And so some questions for us, and I'll also make my point again one more time because I think this is the key for us all to be able to communicate, is that a goal is to keep working forests as working forests and be able to value those products that come out of those forests as part of a climate solution, and then to keep natural forests as natural forests. And that's particularly true in international space. So those are kind of good takeaways. And then some questions for thought, though. what are we already doing that has the climate benefits? So all of us can probably think of different landscapes that we're more or less familiar with, but how can we push the needle to integrate more of these benefits? But maybe even if we're already integrating them, how do we push the needle as far as how we communicate these carbon and climate benefits? So there likely are already those benefits in place to a degree. How can we communicate that better? And then how can we as a forestry community better communicate these benefits overall, so the carbon and the climate benefits? And just to wrap up, I have just a couple more slides just to show you some of the activities we have going on in the Forest Carbon and Climate Program. We'd love to have you be involved in anything. One, we just posted a free learning module at the Climate Change Resource Center in the U.S. Forest Service. And I can send a link along to anyone that's interested. You can Google it as well. So this is I think it's about 20 minutes interactive video with external links if you want to dig in a little bit more on this, on some of the topics like policy and management. And that's freely available. And then we also have a short course that's much more robust that we're launching on July 15th that we would welcome your participation. It's partially subsidized by a USDA grant, so we'd love to have some folks sign up. It is appropriate for Canadian participants as well. It's a lot of we have examples from both the United States and Canada as far as policy, but I think it could be of really great interest to some of the folks on the call, or maybe some others in your organizations as well. And then finally, we have this last year we hosted our own webinar series in partnership with the Forest Climate Working Group. And so you'll see we actually have the last one coming up on July 10th here. You could head over to our website and sign up for that now and get a calendar invite. But we do have all the previous ones recorded and available on our website and downloadable PDFs of the slides. So if they're of interest to you, we'd love to have those materials be utilized as much as possible. So feel free to head there as well. And there's my contact information. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks again.
Thank you, Lauren. So we do have a question posted in the box here, and while we're taking a look at that question, Rocco, perhaps you could advance the slides, make note of, for everyone to seek the opportunity to attend the SFI Annual Conference, which will be held in Richmond, Virginia this year. Please mark that date on your calendar. Reach out to us if you haven't gotten information about that. We'd be happy to do that. And additionally, to make note of the fact that if you want to advance the slides, that you're welcome to reach out to us on the staff at SFI, and we're happy to interact with any of you anytime about topics relative to conservation impact or other work that we're doing. So I will note, Lauren, there has been a question posted here, and I would just suggest that you might limit the answer to this. It could be a long philosophical discussion, but I think the answer to this most relevant to the work that you're doing, and you mentioned the difference between natural forests and working forests, and perhaps you could explain briefly what it is that was meant by that in the context of the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, that's kind of a little bit of a loose question, because there's different layers of, or different levels of productivity or working forest. So you have from one end you have a complete plantation that would be like a monoculture. Then you could have some variants of an in-between where there's different species, and you'd have selective harvesting. And then on the other end you would have it's not harvested. So it may have some selective or maybe some mild activities to maintain forest health, but other than that, it's not really harvested. And so I think clarifying I think the main point is that there are values for the multiple types of forests. So no one's suggesting that all natural forests should be converted to plantations, or that we shouldn't cut any trees and let any sort of working forest be completely natural or hardly managed, but just identifying that there's values for each of them, and there's going to be trade-offs for different forests as well. So if you have one that has less diversity as far as the tree species, more of a plantation style, you're likely going to see a lot less diversity as far as other species that inhabit that space as well. And then but you might have the highest level of carbon growth from something like that. So there ends up being some trade-offs between the forest types. But I think that it can kind of get a little dangerous if you are put too much emphasis on any one thing. So if you're too much emphasis on just carbon production, you're going to lose out on biodiversity. So one of the main takeaways I always like to put out there is thinking of a landscape approach and understanding that different forests can have different values, and there's going to have those trade-offs. So you might have one that, or you might have an area, for example, that has very rich below-ground carbon storage, and it might be better to not harvest that area at all or not bring machinery in there. So there's, and I can direct you as well, there's a new publication out from Todd Ontel et al. From the U.S. Forest Service that talks about carbon management approaches, and it talks about some of these trade-offs between protecting carbon storage and maybe in one case and in another case increasing productivity with a different type of management approach.
Yeah, thank you. As you alluded to, and as I commented, this could be a long philosophical conversation, but I think that's enough to get started with answering that question. I think the next one I might take on, Jacob Dunn asked if there are any studies out there that quantify the additional carbon stored per acre of SFI certified forest versus business as usual. And I would say, Jacob, that one of the things that SFI is endeavoring to do, as Darren pointed out early in the presentation, is to try to better understand the carbon-related values of the SFI footprint, which is considerable across the U.S. and Canada. So it's a very, very large question. It's a different question than asking what is the delta, the difference in potential carbon value of SFI certified forests versus other forests. We haven't yet ventured down the path of trying to answer that question, given the inherent complexity of the first question. And so perhaps at some point we'll be in a position to be able to offer that difference in value. One of the challenges to that, of course, is that the condition of non-certified forests and what those, or non-SFI certified forests at least, and what those would look like in terms of their carbon-related values versus the current condition of SFI certified forests is inherently a speculative question, because that counterfactual doesn't in fact exist in that same place. And so it's a very, very difficult question to ask and to answer. And while we appreciate the value of trying to get at that, we think the answer of being able to at least evaluate and enumerate the current contributions of SFI certified forests is a really, really good place to start. And that's what we're attempting to do now. So are there other questions? You're welcome to either unmute yourself or Rocco, if you happen to have muted everyone, perhaps you can unmute them in case they choose to take that option. But if you can either type it into the space available, or you can raise your hand.
Paul, I have muted almost everyone, and I will unmute everyone. But please, folks, if you're by a jackhammer or doing something else that's loud in the background, please remute yourself after I've unmuted you. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. We'll
the conference has been unmuted. The conference has been unmuted.
So. Yeah, so you're welcome to either speak up or type into the chat box or raise your hand virtually, whatever suits you best. All right, we don't have any other questions as yet coming in. We do have a few minutes left, but I'll turn to my colleague Darren or Rocco. Is there anything that we might have missed here relative to this conversation that might be added?
No, not from my perspective, Paul. The only thing I might mention for the benefit of everyone on, SFI has coordinated another conservation impact webinar that will be coming up in September. So please, we're going to be releasing information on as a hold the date for that very soon. So please be on the lookout for it. It's going to be covering a water value related project in the Atlantic portion of Canada. So just please be on the lookout for that, and past that I've got nothing else to add.
Thank you for that reminder.
I would simply add that with respect to our conference happening in Virginia this year, it's worth noting that we will be having a section on carbon and conservation in managed forests that will further this discussion, I think, quite nicely for those who are interested in this particular topic.
Hi, this is Raphael Sperry. from Arup. Can I offer a comment?
Please do.
So when you were saying we can't define baseline forests and we just need to talk about carbon storage in forests, Lauren's slides were helpful where they showed kind of the additionality zone between two different management practices. She had a couple of slides like that. I really appreciated the clarity of those. And it seems like if we can't define for SFI what a reasonable baseline is and what practices we have that are additional, then we can't really have the conversation on the level that she thinks needs to be had.
I think that's a fair observation, Raphael, and I don't dispute the point. I think it's a matter of ordering our priorities and trying to get through one thing before we get to the second. And so we are doing a lot of work with our colleagues and partners in the nonprofit and academic and research communities to try to better understand the practices that relate to improved carbon considerations and carbon outputs. And so that's part of the equation. The other part of the equation is enumerating a better current understanding, and again, across a very, very large and diverse footprint of current contributions of SFI forests to the carbon equation. And so we are moving in the direction of ultimately gaining a better understanding of that delta, that difference, and certainly that's where we'd like to land. But the work we're currently doing is primarily fueled by our Conservation and Community Partnerships Grants Program, which is a limited source of funding, and so the work is slower than we would like, but we do want to end up where you suggest, and I appreciate that observation.
Thank you.
And by the way, I would say to all on the phone, if you have ideas about our conservation impact work, and certainly the offer stands open to participate in our sounding board where you can learn about these projects up close and have a chance to comment and influence those. We would welcome that brand of input, but certainly if you want to reach out to me and discuss our conservation impact work and ways that we might be able to improve it, I'm always open to those discussions. So I see we're up against the clock. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. Let me offer a thank you to Lauren Cooper at Michigan State University. Lauren, thank you so much for this. Both the presentation and the work itself, I think it adds a lot of value. To my colleagues Rocco and Darren, thank you guys for helping pull this together. And again, the offer stands open to anyone if you want to reach out and learn more about this work. We will have this presentation recorded. There's been a request as to whether or not we might provide a PDF of the presentation itself. Lauren, we haven't had a chance to talk about that, and we can take that up offline. But if we're able to offer that, then certainly that's something that we can make available as well.
It's fine, so, sure.
Is that sound agreeable to you? Maybe you can answer that now.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to share. I'd actually, Rocco has a copy of it, so I'd be happy to make that available. Absolutely.
Okay. So, Victoria, I know you had asked that question. Others, if you'd like to receive a copy of that PDF, please reach out to us and we can make it available. So, in any case, thank you, everyone, and we look forward to your participation, hopefully at the annual conference or at the next Conservation Impact webinar in September. And thank you for your participation today. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thank you.